Hey, welcome back to Midweek Devotional. If you have your Bibles, please turn to Romans chapter 13. We'll be in verse 1 through 7. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. Those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear for the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Well, in Romans chapter 12, Paul says that if you are a Christian, to be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that we can discern the will of God. So as Christians who's been transformed by the gospel of Jesus Christ, that we've been saved by grace through faith, how are we to view or act towards our governing authorities, or in general, just authorities over us? Paul says to submit to them because God has placed them there, and God has instituted these governing authorities over us for what? For our good. And Paul actually says there really is no authority over you except for God. But if God is an authority and he's placed these governing authorities over us, that we should submit to them. And why are they there? One is because they're there for vengeance. They're there to execute God's wrath on those who do wrong. So for example, if someone's trying to get into your home to kill you, I assume that we would call the cops, right? And the cops are there to execute judgment on those who want to murder, those who want to steal from you, those who want to cause chaos in our society and culture. So in a sense, yeah, Paul is saying they're there to execute God's judgment, and they're there because God has placed them there, and they're ministers of God. Now, Paul also says another point about why we should submit to the governing authority over us. Paul says that we should be in subjection to the governing authorities, not just so we can avoid the wrath of God and judgment, and be at the mercy of the law and who God has placed over us, but Paul says be in subjection not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of your conscience. You see, in verse 3, Paul says that for the rulers are not a terror to who? To those who have good conduct, but only to those with bad, right? So I want us to imagine this, that imagine if it was Christians, right? And Christians were the ones that were always getting pulled over every time there's a speeding ticket. Imagine if it was always Christians who were caught cheating on a test at school. Imagine if it was always Christians who were caught lying about things. Imagine if it was always Christians who always did a bad job at work and didn't care about what their boss was telling them, or didn't care about the instructions that the boss was giving them. You see, also in the last chapter, chapter 12, the ending of the last chapter, Paul says, always do what is honorable to all, in front of all. So I believe that Paul is saying, as believers who's been transformed and renewed, believers shouldn't be the ones that are setting bad examples or living chaotically out in the world, breaking every law that there is, not showing up to work on time, cheating on tests, lying, and being the ones that kill, being the ones that do all these things. Because Paul says that Christians live honorably, and Christians should be transformed and renewed in your mind. Do what is good, right? That is why I believe why Paul says in verse 6 to 7 is because of these things. That's why we pay taxes. In verse 7, Paul says what? Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. And so, again, we live as civil people in this world, not just because God has placed the governing authorities over us, or whether it's your parents, your teacher, your boss, whoever it is. We live honorably, and we pay our taxes. We whatever we owe, we do. We don't want to be the ones that are always showing up late to work, or the ones who are caught lying or cheating on a test or whatnot, because we have a higher calling, and it's to be light and salt of this world. Now, what about when the governing authorities or authorities above you is in direct disobedience to God, and they're wanting you to do the same? Now, we see in the Bible there are exceptions when we don't listen to the governing authorities or the authorities above of that is in direct disobedience to God. We see examples like Peter and John or James, when the Pharisees captured them and said, "Stop preaching the gospel." And they said that they would rather listen to God than listen to the words of man, and they kept preaching the gospel. We see Rahab in the Old Testament hiding the two spies and helping them to escape. We see Daniel and King Nebuchadnezzar in the Old Testament, where Daniel refused to bow to the idols or to the king. And so, of course, when it comes to governing authorities that are not aligned with God and want us to not be aligned with God as well, we don't listen to them. But again, I think the whole point of this passage is to help believers to live honorably. And I think a person who lived honorably when it comes to authority is King David. In the Old Testament, King David had an opportunity to kill King Saul when King Saul was after his life. But King David chose not to kill Saul when he had a chance. Why? Because he said that King Saul was God's anointed, and he didn't want to kill King Saul. Now, I think that's such an honorable decision from King David not to do that, because he respected not King Saul, but God's authority. And so for us, you may say, God's anointed and governing authorities, how do those relate? But I would say that we live honorably even in a government that is not always Christian-like, not always Christ-centered, not always believing in God. But then again, we don't want to be the ones that are in jail because we did bad conduct. Again, we don't want to be the ones that are caught cheating and lying and stealing and murdering. That if we have been transformed by the renewing of our mind by the gospel of Jesus Christ and been saved by grace through our faith, then we should live honorably, be the salt and light of this world, instead of being the one that are always revolting and killing and doing bad and having a bad reputation out in the world, right? And so I think for us, a takeaway for us from this passage is, yes, live in good conduct, because if we don't, we should fear the governing authorities who are there to execute God's wrath on those who do wrong. So I encourage you guys as believers to do your best and honor God in all that you do, whether that's working or at school or obeying parents, or as simply as driving out in the road, obeying the laws.